Thanks so much for inviting me. Just listening to your little panel, I think, I don't know why you needed me. I think people have got this pretty clear. But you've got me now, so we'll have a bit of a conversation about this challenge of what does transformational change really look like, and what is the underlying essence of that change. Because when we're embarking on this journey of transformational change, the practicalities of it can be really quite overwhelming, and our focus is often taken by the real challenging issues of how do you design service models, staffing, finance, training, and these things can take our focus to the extent that the fundamental nature of the change, and that is the social and cultural environment in which people can truly live their best lives, is often overlooked. So I want to spend the time we have this afternoon explaining why it is that culture and its underlying values are not trivial matters. Indeed, they are the primary factors that will enable real change to occur. And I'll give you an example from my experience. In the early 2000s, New Zealand engaged in this challenge that you are now facing and closed its largest institution for people with a learning disability. And a piece of independent research was commissioned 12 months later looking at the outcome of this change. And it was found that the advantages gained with the move into the community were already being eroded by the end of the first 12 months. And the reason found was that the services and the staff had not fundamentally changed either their assumptions, their beliefs, or their practices, and that an institutional culture had therefore followed people into new community service models. And the reason that culture is so important and so resistant to change lies in the fact that the cultural beliefs about people are so deeply embedded in our social structure that they operate and impact on our actions at a largely unconscious level. And it's therefore essential that we bring to consciousness the culture that we operate in and be intentional and rigorous around what it is that must change. And the challenge of establishing and safeguarding culture is a key element of success, because culture will enhance or destroy all other attempts that you make at change. And when I'm talking about this, it's not just a change in the culture of organisational practice, although this in itself is a substantive challenge, but a change in the cultural ableism and disableism that lies at the heart of our societies. It's these fundamental cultural beliefs that the bodies and the minds of disabled people are lesser than that leads to practices of social devaluation, discrimination, marginalisation, and ultimately to exclusion from valued society. So I'll endeavour to lay out for some discussion some of what I think are the fundamental cultural shifts and their underlying principles and application in practice. So if we are to authentically move away from an institutional culture and practice, we must have absolute clarity of the underlying values and consistently embrace what I would call life-affirming rather than life-denying principles. Can you shift the slide on? And these life-affirming principles would include recognising the humanity and dignity of people, no matter what their impairment. The right of all people to express their will and preference and to live with freedom and autonomy. that people will always thrive best when the fullness of community is available to them, and growth is ever possible and brings greater life. So I'll focus this morning on 4 key cultural shifts. So if you could move the slide on. And the first issue to be addressed in a cultural shift is this issue of power over, and moving from power over to power with. Because power over, although it's not often recognised or acknowledged, forms the basis of institutional relationships and behaviours within human services. And power over operates within environments in which one person or the system itself has power over another person or one group over another group. And it's based upon a very entrenched belief that disabled people do not have the capacity to express their own will and preference, or that their decisions, if expressed, will not be sound. So to deinstitutionalise then is much more than the closing of facilities or the establishing of alternative models. It begins with the establishment of authentic partnership, or as Michael Kendrick would say, with right relationship between the system and the people being served. And it involves a fundamental challenge of how do you move away from being a service to authentically being of service to this person. And for this change to be evident in reality, it requires that disabled people, their families and support networks are active partners in all decision-making over how, where, and with whom their lives will be lived. And as such, this requires that the foundational principles of the relationship between disabled people, families, and the system are collectively agreed or co-designed, reviewed, and revised together over time as circumstances change. Could you move the slide on? The second key shift is that how you move from prescribed service models and systems to negotiated supports. And within prescribed service models, pre-existing answers are always sought. However, if disabled people are to have authority over their own lives and supports, it's essential that the system is able to sit comfortably with a level of ambiguity where change is the expected constant. And a key factor in much of why we seek to standardise services rather than respond to unique needs is the extent to which most of us are limited by what we've not yet seen or not yet experienced. And our beliefs about what's actually practical and reasonable tend to be things which are already part of our life, what we already know, what we're familiar with, rather than with options that are not yet tried or unfamiliar. So what we consider to be realistic is most often more of what we already have, more of what's already happened, rather than what's not yet happened or what might yet be possible. As Michael Kendrick would say, in many cases, we are deeply sceptical of what is new simply because the old is so comfortable, even when it is not at all satisfying. And so we have some principles that can guide us in making this shift, and the upholding and enhancing the dignity and status of the person. Self-determination, choice and control, all things that you little panel have already spoken to. And flexible, accountable, and consistent support responses. And this requires that we move away from a prescribed set of available service options into which people must fit. To disabled people, families, and support networks, being in the position of being able to negotiate into place the types of support that are going to make sense to them. And while it might be challenging, or indeed might not yet be possible for many of the aspirations of people to be met, we may not have available funding. The system might lack the appropriate skill. We just may not have the state of the art yet available to us. The key principle, however, is that self-determination underlie the decision-making, where disabled people have say-so over how available funding is spent, where they have the full knowledge of the funding that's available to them, how that funding package was arrived at, and the ability to challenge and to negotiate change. And if this doesn't appear to be immediately achievable, then begin with disabled people being able to negotiate smaller but important aspects of their lives, perhaps by being able to choose the staff they want to support them, negotiating roles within the household and personal preferences, such as, I can choose when I go to bed what I do during the day, what I eat, who I associate with. Disabled people being able to negotiate major aspects of the supports provided to them doesn't undermine or negate the value that can be brought by people in paid roles or people with more experience. Rather, it balances out the perspective, experiences, and wisdom of both the parties. In New Zealand, for example, we have this proverb, which is Nākau te ruru, nau te ruru, ki ora ai te iwi. And what that means is, with your breadbasket and my breadbasket, the people will flourish. So if you could move that slide on. The third area of key change is this important area of holding a vision for what's possible. And that is about moving from a weak vision to strong vision and imagining better. And institutional cultures, by their very nature, operate with a weak vision. As disabled people, families, and the staff and the system itself become trapped by assumptions and beliefs about the capability, competency, and potential of disabled people. So an institutional culture is about people being trapped in predetermined solutions that are not relevant to address their needs nor to address their life potential. So institutional cultures operate when you think that what is already available is okay for them. And this has led to the lives of people living with disabilities not being lived to their potential, not because of any personal limitations that the individual might have, but because those of us responsible for the promotion and development of what might be possible in life, including families, are often beset with fears, anxieties, and with stereotypes, and have a limited vision of the potential that disabled people have for a full and purposeful life. However, when we hold a powerful vision for a life that is better, then we embrace hope and we look beyond the moment to the promise of what life might yet offer. We begin to embrace a true realism, a realism that's life-enhancing rather than life-denying. but holding on to a vision for a full, meaningful and inclusive life and the supports required to advance the vision is a key strategy in bringing about a different understanding of what services and supports might look like. You know, the reality is that the reason we have already come this far is because there have been people, disabled people, families and allies, who've refused to accept reality as it is or as the system presents it to us and have pursued other more potent pathways for their lives. And if your vision for what could be better or different passes the test, then you've got the most powerful tool that will change lives. In fact, vision is key in keeping hope alive. And we must never let hope for what could be better die. And hope and vision are far more important and more powerful than money. And the principles that sit within this is a timely response to the unique individual needs of the person being served. With lives anchored in community, always mainstream first. Never resort to the special until you've exhausted the ordinary, and pursue ordinary life outcomes for disabled people. And this requires a move away from assessing people and assigning supports based on the functional deficits that people may have, to planning together to achieve the good things in life. And it requires that before funding, services and supports are determined, that we come to a deep understanding of who is this person, what are their gifts, talents and abilities, how might they best be supported to live a full, meaningful and inclusive life, where would they best be supported, and who might best support them. That supports, once they are determined, are not set in place for all time, but are open to flexibility, to change, to experimenting with what might be new or untried, because this is based on a recognition that with the right support, all people will grow, they will develop, and that needs and aspirations will change over time, and supports required need to be able to change with them. There's always this temptation within the system to have things settled. And this is what I call the do we have the answer for you approach. Imagining better requires that we avoid the temptation of coming to solutions too quickly, and particularly, if we're honest, when we ourselves really do not know the answer, or we do not know what could be possible if we took another approach. Because when we reach solutions too quickly, then we close down potential that could exist. If we as a system settle for prescribed solutions, then what choice do disabled people and their families have? They must settle for these prescribed solutions because they're the only thing that we've got on offer. If you could move the slide on. And the fourth shift that I want to speak about is a shift from what I call managerial leadership to participatory leadership. And institutional cultures rely very heavily on hierarchical management, strategies, policies, and directives. So for disabled people to be able to exercise the rights of citizenship requires that we understand the challenge of how do you move from managerial-based approaches to demonstrating leadership in the development and sustaining of collective, autonomous, and independent voice of disabled people and families in equal and informed partnership with the system. And the values that are going to, the principles that will sit under this is your first voice leadership, meaningful representation, and authentic partnering. It's interesting that it's now very common, in fact universal, that when you talk to services, they describe their services to disabled people as being person-centred. But one of the major challenges to the idea of being truly person-centred is that it's very rare for the person being served to have had any influence at all actually over the way the services are designed, how the service is contracted, how staff are recruited, how budgets allocated. In fact, in most situations, everything about the service is already predetermined before we even know who the person is that's going to be served. But if we embrace a culture of participatory leadership, we need to move from the notion of person-centred to services and supports that are self-directed. And self-direction would include, but not be limited to, and where this is desired by the person, it would include personal budgets, contracts, service agreements negotiated between the person and the service, and options for self or family-governed service approaches, participation in developing position descriptions, job advertisements, etc. And this leads us to really needing to think carefully about, well, what would be the attributes of leadership for cultural change? If you could move the slide on, thanks. There must be deep content knowledge of rights-based support approaches. Persistent role modelling of the change that is required. Open and honest communication with staff, with disabled people and families. Rewarding and reinforcing innovation, strong networking and relationship skills, comfort and ability to delegate authority, and ability to work within authentic partnerships. So to conclude what I have to say, I think so much of what is important in life requires vision, values, and faith in our ability to embrace change. It often requires that we believe in something before it comes true. If we don't have this faith, then we won't do any of the great things that need to be done because we don't believe. We'll not put ourselves out there. We won't take a risk. We must be sincerely convinced within ourselves, or we will always defer committed action and will remain trapped in what already exists. And it's when the hopes and dreams of life that become deferred or ignored that life itself and life's potential will fade. So I just want to end with a little quote from Helen Keller that says, while they were all saying it can't be done, it was done.